In case you missed it, this is our lesson on the physical effects of war. By the end of this lesson, you will know the lasting impact of surviving the Great War, attitudes to disability at that time, and how some fields of medicine were advanced during this period. You will be able to describe disability appropriately when analysing the poem Disabled by Wilfred Owen. So, I need to tell you that I have some issues with this poem. I am a person with a disability, and I really didn't enjoy having to read this poem or having to think about it, talk about it, and prepare a lesson for it. The poems that we've already looked at in this unit, so The Call by Jessie Pope, Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, Many Sisters to Many Brothers, all have, social issues that were markedly different back in the time of the First World War compared to now, 100 years later. For example, women can join the military and go to war if they want to. We no longer view war as a great adventure, and these are things that were in these earlier poems, but we found that modern attitudes to these things have changed. However, based on my own personal experience as a person with disability, I don't think attitudes to disability have necessarily changed much in the last 100 years since 1917. For example, this happened. Hardly anybody that I know outside of the disability community and people that I've shared this with on Facebook have heard about this. This was an attack that happened a week or so ago in Japan. Somebody slashed the throats of 19 people with a disability, injured 26 more. And his reasons for doing so were because he felt that the world would be better without people with a disability. So he'd already written a letter saying he envisioned a world where a person with multiple disabilities can be euthanised with an agreement from the guardians when it's difficult for the person to carry out household and social activities. I am one of those people that finds it difficult to carry out household and social activities. This guy also said it is better that disabled people disappear, and that's what he was intending to do, and he managed it for 19 people. Really, the other thing to note about this particular case is that the names of the murdered people were never released because in Japan it's apparently shameful to have a person with a disability in your family, and so the families didn't want the names released. Here's another example of how attitudes to disability persist negatively. So this was a very popular film from an extremely popular book, but it's essentially a snuff film. The guy commits suicide at the end of the film because he feels his life isn't worth living. When I was looking for this image, I found this image with this little quote, "Push yourself, don't settle, just live." He says that to her. He doesn't apply it to himself. He decides his worth, his life as a person with a disability is never going to be as good as it was before he got his disability, therefore he's going to kill himself. And this is universally lauded, except for people really in my community, as an amazing love story and really inspirational. And oh, how beautiful that is. And I just hate it. The other thing about this to note is that, this theme or trope of life with a disability is not worth living is repeated over and over and over again, and is almost the only story that we ever hear about disability in mainstream media. You very rarely hear positive stories about some guy who happens to have quadriplegia who turned out to be an architect or a teacher or a Paralympian. You don't hear those stories, you hear these stories. He nobly sacrifices himself for her, because apparently he leaves her all his money so she can live a life that he felt he wasn't entitled to. So ableism is the term we use to describe disability discrimination, and these are some of the ways that ableism is experienced by people like me, and I've experienced all of these. So language. If you're using language such as retard, spastic or mental, anything else that's remotely, related to a disability, and you're using it as an insult, please stop it. It's offensive. I'm as offended by retard, even though I don't have an intellectual disability, as I am by any other pejorative pertaining to my disability. Not providing inclusive access. So, for example, if your establishment doesn't have wheelchair access, if your website or your video doesn't have captions, or your TV show doesn't have captions, if you're not including everybody in the community, you're excluding people with a disability, whether accidentally or intentionally, that's ableism. Using accessible facilities, so permanent only parking, commonly referred to as wheelchair parking, but it's not only for people with wheelchairs, it's for anybody with a disability that requires, accessible parking. Accessible bathrooms, yes, there's no laws around accessible bathrooms, but still, if you don't need to use it, and you're getting in the way of somebody who can only use an accessible bathroom, you're really being an ableist person. And don't tell us things like you're only going to be a minute. It's annoying and it's insulting, because most of us can't be only a minute at anything. Making assumptions about a person's abilities or lack thereof, but also assumptions about what a person with a disability would or wouldn't want to do, not just what they would or wouldn't be able to do. If you have a question about what somebody wants to do, ask the person with the disability. Don't make judgments on your own. You'll probably invariably be wrong. And mocking disability. So I really, really hope that there aren't any Donald Trump fans watching this, and I doubt there is, because with disabled in the title, I'm sure, they'd skim right over it. Don't mock a disability. This image that I shared this is an example of a parking incident. So the yellow hash marks under that space, they are actually the access areas next to, in between, two accessible parking places. That space is needed for people to get in and out of their cars. So, for instance, I have to open the door of my car all the way open so I can get my wheelchair in and out, and I can get into my car. If that space is blocked by a car, a motorbike, a shopping trolley, I can't use the space. I can't get out of my car, I can't go to my appointment, do my shopping, whatever it is. So don't be that person. So getting back to 1917 and this poem, and talking about the word disabled. So adding a dis prefix to a word changes it to an adjective or creates an antonym, so the opposite. So, for instance, you have an advantage or you have a disadvantage. You embark on a journey or a plane or a boat, or you disembark. It's the opposite. You are able and then you are disabled. So, disabled is an adjective, but it's also a process. Somebody was abled, now they're disabled. And this applies to this poem very much. Other terms of disability that existed in 1917 and persist today include, but are not limited to, invalid, 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 cripple, handicapped. Okay, do not use these words to describe disability. Handicapped in particular, I know it's used commonly in America, but it's not used in Australia or the UK. Is deemed to be very offensive because it really harks back to those old times where people with disability had to beg for survival. They couldn't work. There was no welfare state, and it's actually derived from cap in hand, a reference to begging. So do not use any of these words. Use disability, has a disability, is disabled. Yeah. Okay, so 1917 when he wrote the poem, towards the end of the war, although at that time they didn't know it was towards the end of the war. We only know that in retrospect. At the time, the war was ongoing. It had been going for 3 years. There didn't seem to be any end in sight. And throughout this whole campaign, many, many men were returning injured. So they were burned, for instance, from mustard gas or explosions, things being set on fire because they've been bombed or shot. Missing limbs, blind, death, especially from, percussive injuries, head injuries, getting a bomb exploded next to your head, or disabled in some way. They're regarded by society as broken, no longer whole, no longer men. Shell shock should be included here. It's not necessarily a physical disability in the way these other ones are, but is as disabling. And I think nowadays, in our modern context, we absolutely recognise that PTSD, which was what we now refer to shell shock as, is a significant side effect, impact, of that kind of experience. Social attitudes towards men were such that they became outcasts of very few opportunities. At that time, and for a very long time after this, there's no social welfare. There is no unemployment benefit. There's no disability support, money or services or anything. At this time, women were economically dependent upon men. You were economically dependent on either your father, your brother, or your husband. If your husband or the person that you want to marry can no longer work, how can you marry that person? If marrying them means that you cannot survive. There are very few employment opportunities for women outside of cooking, cleaning, being a domestic servant, perhaps some sewing, but really very few opportunities. So having a man being unable to work, and don't forget that the society wasn't set up for men to come back and work in their jobs on the land, in offices, whatever it was, with a disability. Wheelchair access wasn't a thing for a very, very long time until after that. So these men were returning from war, okay, and one of the reasons they were returning with their injuries was because more soldiers were surviving. There'd been advances in things like infection control, germ control, keeping things clean. That was a real end of the 19th century thing, recognising that connection between dirt and contamination and infection. They had penicillin to help combat infections, although antibiotics were not yet invented, so infection was still a massive killer. And basically, by on-the-job learning, they were able to keep more men alive from injuries that would normally previously have killed them. Because of this, medical fields of plastic surgery and prosthetics were rapidly advanced, and there are some video links here so that you can... I actually don't know if this works. And now you see all my tabs.
The history of prosthetics dates from antiquity, and for the most part, prosthetics, upper limb prosthetics, were made for warriors who lost a limb in combat so that they could continue to be fighters. And most of these prosthetics were made of iron or wood. The early prostheses were made one at a time, not in any mass production. They were made like an artist makes a piece of art. And who were able to get these prostheses were people who had the means, the money. World War I saw millions of men engaged in combat, which was very different than previous wars. Now we had entire countries, millions of men fighting with enormous numbers of casualties. And the volume of these casualties drove the development of specialty centers for these patients, mainly in Europe where the casualties were. And this brought about a big change in the relationship between surgeons who dealt with the wounds and the prosthetic makers. Before that time, the surgeon would treat the wound, and then the person would have to go find a prosthetic maker. World War I brought about this collaboration where the prosthetists and the surgeons worked together in the same hospital, collaborating on developing and fitting prostheses for wounded soldiers. And that persists to this day. The materials were basically the same, even during and after World War I.
I need to go back to... Here we go. So you may need to Google those and find those videos. They're quite easy to find on YouTube. Okay, so we have the poem. So you need to read through the poem. I'm going to have to do this in the second part of my video because I only have 15 minutes per video. So I'll be back for part 2.